West Jerusalem as Israelis wake up after a tumultuous night of protests and the Prime Minister's evening speech. Many are adamant that the protests will continue until their demands are met. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced Monday night that he is suspending controversial judicial reforms to allow dialogue and avoid civil war, which succumbed to mounting pressure from his own coalition after one of the largest protests in Israeli history. The proposed changes would see Supreme Court's power to rule laws unconstitutional removed, and would give the government more say in selection of judges, with proposals that angered many in Israel. People had been protesting proposed reforms for months, but after Netanyahu was sacked a day after Defense Minister Yoav Gallant called for a halt to the process, tens of thousands of people gathered in streets in spontaneous outrage. Depicting the protesters as extremists, Netanyahu portrayed his surrender to opposition through the biblical character of King Solomon, famous for his wisdom and tolerance. Civil war is forbidden. Israeli civil society was frozen that day as things went on as usual in Israel's fortified Supreme Court, steps away from the Prime Minister's office where Netanyahu was speaking. Flights from Ben Gurion Airport, along with universities, shopping malls, and many other institutions across the country, were suspended for a day as the Greater Histadrut Labor Federation declared a historic strike. Earlier Tuesday morning, Israeli President Isaac Herzog called on government and the opposition to initiate an urgent negotiation process to find a compromise proposed judicial reform. Growing opposition in the ranks. Netanyahu's plan was temporarily scuttled by growing opposition among members of his own party, and growing resistance from Israel's reservists, who refused to do military service. While opposition has been quietly growing within Netanyahu ranks for weeks, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was the first to officially break the standings on Saturday night and deserved an early sacking on Sunday night. Gallant's firing was the last straw, while Netanyahu swore on the correctness of his course and his intention to continue to push for judicial reform. Seeing mandatory civilian army as necessary to protect country from imminent disaster, Israeli society has proven highly sensitive to dismissal of a defense minister, especially under current circumstances and with perception that Netanyahu has self-interested political motives. Netanyahu is traditionally seen as a supporter of Supreme Court, who spoke 3 years ago about the importance of an independent judiciary, explains Eli Koaz, policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. Many see his motivation as basically escape from his legal enigma and 3 indictments. People perceive this as Netanyahu willingly jeopardizing the country's military readiness for his own political ends. There shouldn't be a civil war. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced a delay in his controversial judicial overhaul plan. The move comes after months of protests against the reforms peaked this week. #pic.twitterztejnbbnr. Al Jazeera English March 27, 2023. Gallant spoke out, saying that in wake of growing unrest within ranks of army, particularly in nation's reserves, the country has exposed potential weaknesses that could be exploited by its enemies. Refusal to serve in Israeli army reserves is seen as taboo and shocking for Israelis, according to Tal Sagi Breaking the Silence, a group of former Israeli army soldiers and members of the anti-occupation bloc. It is your application for military service, belonging, and more in Israeli society. It's something you'll want to give back your community and take care of your family and community. Sagi explains how the anti-occupation bloc has gained increasing acceptance by other anti-judicial reform protesters as protests have progressed in recent months, particularly since the pogrom in Huwara. In the anti-occupation bloc, there were many attacks against people carrying the Palestinian flag at first. Now I see less and less violence. As if protest became more comfortable with the fact that flag existed. While protests that continued on Sunday night throughout Monday were mainly about Israeli security and their judicial rights under attack by a dictatorial leader, the anti-occupation bloc took advantage of opportunity to educate thousands of Israelis outraged by Netanyahu his coalition. Anti-occupation protester Jacob Abulafia said, across 3 months, and especially after pogrom Huwara, there are growing awareness that what is happening in occupation, occupied territories, and on streets of Israel interconnected. At least 10,000 people asked, where were you in Huwara? You heard him shout. After listening to his speech, Koaz predicted that Netanyahu would bow to his right-wing coalition partners, and said the protest movement would continue until the proposed changes were completely suppressed. Netanyahu made a gift Ben Gvir faction, he said, referring creation of an indefinite, national civilian force, under strict MP persuade him not leave coalition. I think the protests will continue, maybe not as much, but more on a weekly basis. The far-right protesters who took to the streets overnight to support Netanyahu and his judicial reforms faced off against the anti-judicial protesters, threatening them and causing in some places.